The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and neither had Margaret's tears. She sat in the corner booth of the downtown diner at 2 a.m., her nurse's scrubs still damp from the storm, her hands trembling around a coffee cup she couldn't bring herself to drink. 36 hours of back-to-back shifts, 4 patients lost, and a voicemail from her landlord about eviction had finally broken something inside her that she thought was unbreakable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, and she wondered, not for the first time that night, if anyone would even notice if she just disappeared. That's when the door chimed and she walked in. Margaret didn't look up at first. She'd learned long ago not to make eye contact with strangers in all-night diners, not to invite conversation when your soul felt like shattered glass. But there was something about the way this woman moved, something deliberate yet gentle, like she was carrying the weight of the world but refused to let it show. She wore a faded red coat that had seen better decades, and her silver hair was pulled back in a bun that was coming loose from the rain. The woman didn't sit down. She didn't order. She simply walked to Margaret's booth and set something on the table. A small envelope, yellowed with age, and a single white carnation that somehow looked fresh despite the storm outside. "This is for you," the woman said, her voice carrying an accent Margaret couldn't quite place. Something European, maybe Eastern European, worn smooth by years in America. Margaret stared at the envelope. "I think you have the wrong person." "No, dear. I have exactly the right person." The woman's eyes, pale blue and impossibly kind, held Margaret's gaze. "You're the one who held my grandson's hand last Tuesday. Room 407, you sang to him when he was afraid. You stayed 20 minutes past your shift because you didn't want him to be alone." The memory rushed back. The little boy with leukemia. No family present, terrified of the dark. Margaret had been exhausted even then, but she'd seen the fear in his eyes and couldn't leave. She'd sung every lullaby she could remember, her voice cracking with fatigue, until he'd finally fallen asleep. "How did you—" "He told me about you, about the nurse with the kind eyes who made him feel brave." The woman's weathered hand reached out and covered Margaret's. "I've been looking for you for 3 days. I needed to say thank you, and I needed to give you this." Margaret opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was a letter handwritten in careful script and 5 $20 bills. The letter began, "My name is Elena Kowalski. I came to America in 1952 with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. I was 17 years old and I was terrified." As Margaret read, Elena sat down across from her, uninvited but somehow welcome. The letter told a story of a young refugee who'd been taken in by a stranger in New York, a woman who'd given Elena not just a room, but hope. That stranger had taught Elena English, helped her find work, and never asked for anything in return. "She saved my life," the letter read, "not with grand gestures, but with small acts of kindness when I needed them most. Before she died, she made me promise to pass it forward, to watch for the moments when someone needs grace, and to be brave enough to offer it. I've been keeping that promise for 72 years, Elena said quietly. "The money isn't much, I know, but it's what I had in 1952 when Mrs. Henderson gave it to me for my first month's rent. I've replaced it 100 times, given it away 100 times, always with a letter telling the story. And it always comes back to me somehow, so I can give it again." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen solid. "I can't take this." "You can. You must. Because I see it in your eyes, child. The same look I had all those years ago. The look that says, you're not sure you can keep going." Elena's voice was firm now, loving but insistent. "That money isn't for rent or bills or anything practical. It's to remind you that you matter, that what you do matters. That boy in room 407, he's going to remember you for the rest of his life. However long or short that life may be, you gave him a moment of peace. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" The tears came then, hot and sudden, and Margaret didn't try to stop them. The exhaustion, the fear, the bone-deep weariness of caring for others while feeling like she herself was drowning, all of it poured out in that sticky booth while rain hammered the windows and the night pressed in from all sides. Elena didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply sat there, one hand on Margaret's, while the young nurse cried. When the storm inside finally calmed, Elena pulled a napkin from the dispenser and handed it over. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "Never apologize for being human." Elena smiled, and Margaret noticed the deep lines around her eyes. Each one a story of laughter and sorrow survived. "Now I need you to do something for me. When you're ready, when you've caught your breath and found your feet again, I need you to watch for someone else who needs this. You'll know them when you see them, and you'll pass the letter on with your own story added to mine." Margaret looked at the worn envelope, at the careful handwriting that had survived decades. What if I can't? What if I'm not strong enough? "Oh, my dear girl!" Elena stood slowly, her joints creaking with age. "You sang to a dying child when you could barely stand. You've been strong enough all along. You just forgot for a moment. We all forget sometimes. That's why we need each other, yes? To remember for each other when the dark gets too heavy." She buttoned her faded red coat and prepared to face the storm again. At the door, she turned back one last time. "The carnation is from my garden. White for remembrance. Remember tonight. Remember that you're not alone. Remember that kindness is never wasted, even when it feels invisible." And then she was gone, disappearing into the rain-soaked night like a ghost or an angel or simply an old woman with a long memory and a longer heart. Margaret sat in the booth for another hour, reading and rereading the letter, tracing the names that had been added over the years. Elena Kowalski, 1952. Robert Chen, 1927. Maria Santos, 1983. David Washington, 1999. Sarah O'Brien, 2015. Each one had added a few lines, a brief story of receiving the letter at their darkest moment and what it had meant to them. At the bottom, in the space left for her, Margaret pulled a pen from her purse. Her hand was steady now. She wrote, "Margaret Williams, 2025. Received this when I had forgotten why I became a nurse. Was reminded that caring for others is the most human thing we can do, especially when it costs us something. Will watch for the next person who needs to remember they matter." She folded the letter carefully back into its envelope and tucked it into her bag with the 5 $20 bills. They felt heavy with history, with all the lives they'd touched, all the dark nights they'd illuminated with proof that someone, somewhere was paying attention. 3 weeks later, Margaret was restocking supplies in the hospital cafeteria when she saw her. A young resident, maybe 25, sitting alone in the corner, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her badge said Dr. Patel, and her eyes held the same desperate exhaustion Margaret had seen in her own mirror that rainy night. Margaret's heart knew before her mind did. She reached into her locker and pulled out the envelope and a white carnation she'd been carrying, waiting for this moment. Her hands were steady as she walked across the cafeteria, past the vending machines and the tired night shift workers, toward the young doctor who looked like she was drowning. "Excuse me," Margaret said gently. "I think this is for you." Dr. Patel looked up confused, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't understand." "You will," Margaret promised, setting the envelope and flower on the table. "There's a letter inside. It's a long story, one that started 72 years ago and doesn't end here. Read it when you're ready, and know that what you're feeling right now, it doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. It makes you exactly the kind of doctor your patients need." She saw recognition flicker in the young woman's eyes. That moment when a drowning person realizes someone has thrown them a rope. Margaret squeezed her shoulder gently and walked away. Not waiting for thanks, not needing explanation. Outside, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Margaret stood for a moment in the parking lot, feeling the weight she'd been carrying for weeks finally begin to lift. She thought about Elena, wondered if the old woman was still out there somewhere, watching for the next soul in need. She thought about Mrs. Henderson from 1952, whose single act of kindness had rippled forward through time, touching lives she'd never meet in ways she'd never know. And she thought about the little boy in room 407, now in remission, who still asked for the nurse who sang to him in the dark. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. The eviction notice had been resolved with Elena's gift. But more than that, it had given her something money couldn't buy. The reminder that she wasn't just surviving, she was part of a chain of kindness stretching, back through time and forward into a future she couldn't see. She made a donation to the hospital's patient care fund, then sent a text to her sister. Dinner this week? Miss you. Small acts, small moments, small choices that somehow added up to a life worth living. As she drove home through the city streets, Margaret passed a homeless veteran sitting outside a closed grocery store. Normally, she would have driven past, exhausted and empty, but tonight she pulled over. She didn't have much to give, but she had a warm blanket in her trunk and a few dollars in her wallet. She had time for a conversation. She had space in her heart to see another human being. "Thank you," the man said, his eyes surprised by the kindness. "God bless you." "We bless each other," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the words. That's how it works. Later, in her small apartment, Margaret made herself tea and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on like stars. Somewhere out there, Dr. Patel was reading a letter written by a young refugee in 1952. Somewhere, Elena Kowalski was sleeping peacefully, her promise to Mrs. Henderson kept for another day. Somewhere, people were suffering and people were healing. People were breaking and people were putting themselves back together, with trembling hands and stubborn hope. And Margaret was part of it all. Not separate, not alone, not invisible. She was a link in a chain that stretched farther than she could see, held together by the simple radical act of caring when caring was hard, of choosing kindness when kindness felt impossible, of remembering that every person she met was carrying a hidden struggle, and that sometimes the smallest gesture could be the thing that saved them. She picked up the carnation Elena had given her, now dried and preserved in a small vase, white for remembrance. She would remember. And when her own strength faltered, when the darkness felt too heavy again, she would remember that somewhere in the world, someone was watching for the moment they could offer grace to a stranger. That night, Margaret slept deeply for the first time in weeks, and in her dreams, she saw an endless line of people, stretching back through time and forward into tomorrow, each one holding a single white carnation, each one passing forward a gift they'd received when they needed it most. Her, and her, and her, and him, and them. An infinite chain of humanity at its best, proving that we're never as alone as we feel, and love is never as small as it seems. The story doesn't end here. It never really ends. Somewhere tonight, someone will receive an envelope and a flower. Someone will remember they matter. Someone will keep going. And tomorrow, they'll watch for someone else who needs to remember the same thing. That's how we save each other. That's how we save ourselves.